Welcome to Advanced TV Herstory. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Connecting the dots of TV and women to politics and culture, and along the way we have fun here at Advanced TV Herstory, thinking back to great actors, series that shaped us, and all the ways we've seen ourselves on TV. Today's episode is a look at the 5 hit sitcoms that featured a 4-woman lineup. Starting off with The Golden Girls, that aired in 1985 to 1992, created by Susan Harris. Designing Women aired 1986 to 1993 and was created by Linda Bloodworth Thomason. Then we have Living Single, which was on Fox, and that was from 1993 to 1998, helmed by Yvette Lee Bowser. Sex and the City was the first big hit on a premium cable channel on HBO, 1998 to 2004. Candace Bushnell and Darren Star led that series. And finally, Girlfriends, which ran 2000 to 2008, which was on UPN, and Mara Brock-Akil was the showrunner. What do all of these series have in common? Wow, a lot. So, in this episode, we're talking with Summer Martin of the Unconventional Woman podcast, and she's back to talk about these shows and her memories around these shows. Summer's insights into memorable characters and role models are so valuable, and I'm grateful that she's been a part of so many of these recent episodes talking about that. Then you'll hear from favorite contributor to this podcast, Dr. Wendy Burns-Ardolino. Wendy was an early guest on episodes in which we talked about the 4-female construct of TV sitcoms, many of them that we're going to talk about again today, and the findings she wrote about in her 2016 book, TV's Female Foursomes and Their Fans. A favorite episode of this podcast, of mine, is about the tabloids' shaming of Designing Women's Delta Burke, who played Suzanne Sugarbaker, over her weight gain, and how Burke and showrunner Linda Bloodworth Thomason leveraged that to craft one of the most memorable episodes of TV. Find that link in the show notes. Okay, folks, let's set the scene. It's a kitchen, and 4 women are seated.
So while Summer and I have talked in depth and gushed about all sorts of shows and characters and women and performers and writers and showrunners, there are a number of series, largely sitcoms, that comprised 4 different, rather consistent character archetypes. And these series sort of generate role models, but sometimes they're situational role models, and they run the gamut of good and bad and ethical and all of it. So we're just going to jump in and do kind of a lightning round of sorts about these, because they are all seminal series that are going to be with us for a long time to come, and they all meant different things to different audiences when they aired, and even today in syndication. Let's start off with The Golden Girls. Dal, what do you think?
You can do no wrong. The Golden Girls, I have become more in love with over the last 20 years, definitely adulthood. When it was airing live, not so much. I was, young, not really paying attention to it. And at that point, it was like, what are these older women on TV? But then as you get older, seasoned, mature, wiser, you realize, oh my goodness, the life lessons that these 4 women were teaching the girls, as they say.
Right.
Yes, it was. It was like, having that front row seat to your aunties and the conversations as a youth or a child you're not privy to, because you're not old enough to be in there. So I love the Golden Girls. All of the characters mean so much to me. They all have their individual personalities and spins.
And you were saying, the conversations of your aunties that you weren't privy to, that either does not necessarily strike a young person as interesting,
correct,
or as valuable.
Right.
So we lionize a group of wise old men sitting around having a deep intellectual conversation, but we don't spend too much time listening in on the conversations of these very wise women who are similarly solving problems, propping each other up, consoling, doing whatever. So it is the series that continues to offer up the lessons about ageism and recognizing that back in 1985 to 1992, the performers were not even really that old. And Estelle Getty was the youngest of all of them and was playing the oldest.
Right.
And what it is that we expect from women and what we don't expect of them. And then how it is that this group of four surprise us with these timeless conversations. We can find universal lessons in adolescence and the storytelling that's done in My So-Called Life for Daria. Well, you know what? These are conversations that are timeless and universal as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's what makes that series rich.
Yes, agreed.
So I put these forth in chronologic order because to some degree, I believe that each one of them sort of stands on the previous one's shoulders. And so just a year later, Designing Women came out on a different network, different showrunner, Linda Bloodworth-Thomason, as opposed to Susan Harris. Susan Harris had created Soap. Designing Women comes forward for women in the South. All of them have agency. They are a testimonial to shoulder pads and really big hair. Do you like Designing Women?
I do. I want to relive that moment in time. I remember looking at it a little bit, but it didn't resonate as much. You know, it was just one of those shows at prime time. It was on and my mother was watching it and I would kind of come in every now and then. And I know certain characters like Delta Burke's character, Suzanne, you know, she was the glamorous one, if you will. So I remember her, but I also remember Julia Sugarbaker. She was, again, another badass.
Yep.
They covered hard topics. All of these shows that we're going to talk about covered relatable topics, but I happen to be looking at a clip where it was talking about AIDS and the stigma with that. There's a slang term we like to use called reading a person, which is just basically telling a person about themselves. Well, Julia, I mean, before read was mainstream and a thing, in this particular episode, she read this self-righteous Christian woman who had all her assumptions of what AIDS victims look like. And they did that. They pushed the envelope. And so I need to find where that show is airing so I can relive that.
One of the benefits of back when it was mainly just the major broadcast networks, and then a little bit of cable, back when everything was a little bit more centralized, is that the work of something like Designing Women became a much higher profile shared experience. And so having grown up in the North, I just didn't have that much exposure to Southern women. You had WKRP in Cincinnati, and you had the Bob Newhart show set in Chicago. So it wasn't just either LA or New York. There were some great shows that were set in places other than those.
Right.
And it made us, I think, a little bit more understanding of our differences, but also celebrated our shared experiences and our shared values.
Yes.
It feels like in this very divided time that we need more of those because there are people who think just like we do, living way far from where we live. And the urban and the rural, or the North and the South, or the Christian and the non-Christian. No, that's not where America gets its strength, from that kind of division. We can segue into, quite honestly, Living Single, which, again, sort of, if you want to talk about a division, there are many, many comparisons of Living Single, which ran 1993 to 1998. Showran by Yvette Lee Bowser. 4 women in New York, Black women. And sure enough, they were about a year before Friends landed.
I was just about to say, yeah. Ahead of its time, if you will, in terms of really seeing young, up-and-coming Black women who were...
They all worked.
Correct. They all worked. Lawyers, journalists, different professions. And just, again, kind of the normal ins and outs of just being in your 20s and being an adult. There wasn't particularly Black issues, per se. There were just issues and dealings and living life with your girlfriends by your side in a 90s kind of world. I couldn't help myself. But yeah, that show definitely was instrumental in starting to see yourself again.
Yeah. So it was on Fox. There was a period of time where Fox was doing a tremendous amount of development of series, just like Living Single.
Yeah.
I did an interview with Kim Fields when she came out in 2016 or 2017 with her memoir Blessed Life, and she was interviewed for this podcast. She talks about Living Single.
Out. Yes, I mean,
and Erica Alexander is still very involved in developing products and doing some small films and things. I saw her on a webinar that was put on by the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media. So,
yes.
And of course, Queen Latifah is involved in all sorts of things, sort of becoming, again, one of those high-level agents of change.
Yes. Yeah.
And I still think she is a second coming of Pearl Bailey, if you ask me.
Oh my goodness. That's good.
Yeah. So Fox, Fox is Living Single a year before NBC came out with Friends. There are a lot of, and Friends getting appropriate and deserved criticism for being so white and so dismissive of
anybody else.
Yeah. They deserve it. And and Living Single, if you haven't had a chance, catch a couple episodes and enjoy just good, clean coming of age humor. You're right. That takes us to Sex and the City. And some would say it's comparative girlfriends. So we will talk about them independently, but they are very much sort of cut from the same cloth, and that is those coming of age when you're in your 30s.
Mm-hmm. Sex and the City. I categorize this as a memorable series. I vividly recall where I was when this show premiered. Thank God my parents were generous with allowing me to have HBO or access to it. I was in high school, and I was one of those every Sunday night tuned in. Sex in the City was aspirational. As you're an impressionable late teen into your 20s and you're seeing this on television, you want to be that. You strive for that. You want the relationships. You want those girlfriends in your life. The richness was in the blend of all of them. And so I had the DVD set. I watched the show now. In fact, when the movie premiered, I was one of those that bought an outfit to go see it the day it came out. You would have thought I was going to the actual premiere. Okay. That me and my girlfriend's best dress. I have never dressed so good for a movie in my life, but it was important to, and that goes back to our previous conversation about, costume designers and Patricia Fields and what she brought in terms of elevating fashion it was a character in itself. We weren't talking about Manolos before Sex in the City. That's another one I can go on and on. I'm going to stop though.
This podcast has gone on a little bit with regard to Sex in the City. When we interviewed Jennifer Cation Armstrong, who wrote, again, another oral history, she went back and tracked through the development of it. And Candace Bushnell and Darren Star, the evolution from the book, HBO finally being the one who would take a chance on it because so much of the content was really not for prime time. If it was going to be done in such a way that it was authentic and true.
Correct. And it was the raunchiness. That was part of it. The realness. I mean, life is not ponytails and rainbows all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Sex and the City absolutely has a place in feminism, sometimes a controversial place. It has a place in... it too, like Friends, probably
a little white.
Thank you for saying that, because I was gonna,
Now I'll give them credit. There was, and I don't know what season it was, but when Miranda had her relationship with Blair Underwood,
yes,
I tipped my hat off for them exploring that subject matter.
We hold it in high regard. It will be a classic just as much as all the others that we identified for all those good reasons. Yes. And the comparison made to Girlfriends, which aired 2000 to 2008 on a lesser network. I think people, if you had HBO and Sex and the City was on, well, you were part of a different club. Mm-hmm. And it was an adult show, so you couldn't watch it with your kids. And you probably weren't even watching it with your husband or your boyfriend.
Right.
So Girlfriends instead was UPN, which was, if you had a dial, before extensive, oh my gosh, cable has just changed our world. But, it was on like that channel 45 on the dial, the lower dial of UHF or whatever.
And back then that network was really good with having a lot of Black shows.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Girlfriends, it ended abruptly. They did not get a chance to kind of close out the series. Tracee Ellis Ross is obviously the breakout star of Girlfriends. I just think that there is an incredible loyal following to that series. It is somewhat timeless. It's clever. It's set in LA, which was a rich and fresh deviation from what had just become sort of this New York trope that there aren't young adults in LA. I mean, they're only in New York. So that was fun.
It was certainly my goal to show women as we are. We aren't perfect. We aren't a positive image and we are not a negative image. We are women. And we deserve to be flawed and vulnerable and strong and powerful and funny and messed up. I wanted to say something else. And still be worth rooting for. And that's what we put into those ladies. I put everything I had in that show. And I gave my best. And I think I'm very, and as did they. You don't do it alone.
I really enjoyed Girlfriends, watched the whole series. It was good writing, good performances, an interesting blend of the four of them that were somewhat predictable and yet, again, fresh.
And I let Cynthia do most of the talking on this series because guess what, folks? I have never seen, I've seen like one or two episodes in the beginning and it did not catch me, perhaps because I was still so infatuated with Sex and the City. However, I did my homework and I believe this Friday, Netflix will begin streaming Girlfriends. So I can't wait. I've got my reminder set to jump on that train and see where it goes.
I think it's the fun aspect of it, in addition to it just being a really well-rounded show, is that it is Tracy Ellis Ross evolving into her moment.
And that's what I need to see. Because obviously I watched Blackish and I've seen the evolution in the later years, most recent, but I need to see her in Girlfriends.
Yeah, I am just a huge fan of not just all of her talent and how she handles herself and her timing. She has such incredible timing, but the idea that she is growing up with a mother who is an icon. Oh my gosh.
Landscapers just showed up.
I guess they're telling us.
Just a side note.
Yeah, they're telling us it's time. Summer, this has been so much fun.
Oh my gosh, I can do this all day long. Thank you again for inviting me here. This has just been a treat.
There are specific episodes where it's clear who the role model is for that particular issue, right? For that particular concern. There may be certain characters who slot into that positionality more readily or more easily on an ongoing basis, like who we're more used to being in that role. And in my book, I talked about the glue characters often also being the moral interlocutors for the show. So I think a lot of times those folks are the role models. But for example, we see Khadijah James as the role model for the professional, self-built, self-directed, responsible African-American woman, upwardly mobile character. But on the flip side of that, in her quest to be self-sufficient, there are episodes where she ignores her own needs. She ignores her friends. She sells out her business, which is not like the whole reason she went into business for herself is to like be true to the people that she serves and to be the voice of the people through Flavor magazine. She goes with this advertising company that is not proffering goods and services that are beneficial to her community. And so she actually is the kind of cautionary tale on those episodes.
Can I ask you used a phrase that I've never heard before, clearly from the ivy-covered halls of academia, moral interlocutor?
Yeah.
Is that what? Explain for the folks listening what that means for a character.
Well, I was going to say and I also talk about in that same vein about those characters as the voice of reason on their respective shows. So often they are the ones who are like saying, hey, you don't lend money to your friends, or hey, you always go down with the ship. They have the ground where they are serving as kind of the authority on morality on the show.
So in Sex and the City, Charlotte being aghast when Samantha is going to bed on the first date.
Although in that case, I do think that because she's like the Pollyanna too, she's like always being super ultra conservative. Carrie is more often the moral interlocutor on that show because her vantage point allows for multiple behaviors, but she also reins the other characters in. She'll be like, okay, honey, but you really did sleep with 3 men in one night. Right? It's not just Charlotte saying you went to bed with a guy on the first night. Carrie's saying, okay, we're willing to give you a certain amount of leadway, but you also need to consider this. And then she does it to herself too. 40 and fabulous ? And then she's like, oh my gosh, is this true? Am I really? So she's questioning herself and being the moral interlocutor for herself too.
Sure. So we've talked a little bit about living single, Sex and the City. Who was the moral interlocutor in Golden Girls? I'm never going to be able to get that phrase out.
Dorothy. Almost always. Blanche's femme fatale character. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The Jezebel, the femme fatale. And so, of course, she is not moral in those ways. I just saw the episode again where she dates a guy named Rex, and he's like, taking advantage of her. He's like using her for laundry services. He's not showing up for dates on time. He's telling her she's dressed wrong. He's being gruff and angry with her. And finally, Dorothy confronts Blanche, and Blanche says, oh, honey, you're crazy. And besides, he's the best looking guy we know, blah, blah. You're just jealous. And then he shows up for a date, and Blanche goes to get her purse or change clothes or something. And Dorothy says, now, just a second here. You can't treat my friend like that. And he grabs Dorothy's wrist, and Blanche comes out and is like, take your hands off my friend. So it's funny because then Blanche sees what Dorothy was saying in terms of that this guy is really not treating her the way he should be treating her. And in fact, he's a brute and a jerk. On Girlfriends. Okay, so Toni Childs has a baby with her husband, Todd, and then she makes a deal that her baby become Jewish, can be placed in the mikveh. The issue for Maya is you are an African-American Christian, and that is our history, and that is a proud history. And I mean, she says she does not want to be flagged and pulled to the side on Judgment Day because Toni sold her baby out so she could get, child support or get a, better situation for herself in divorce with Todd. She's just like, that is not okay with me. And I feel like that's a real moment of contestation in terms of what is the role of the Black church in African-American communities, and in particular in the lives of African-American women and their families, especially in cases of divorce or where the family has been split in some way. So that moment of contestation is very palpable on the show.
Who was the voice of reason on Girlfriends then? Because I would have said that it was Joan.
Joan. Yeah, most of the time it is Joan. In that episode, she's like, this is a quagmire, right? She is trying to honor the multicultural, multi-religious approach and talk about religiosity. And Lynn is talking about how people of color, lots of Black people are Muslim. And there's this great line where Maya's like, well, I don't know anything about that. And then Lynn says, well, I don't know anything about that either, but I just know there's a lot of them. So, I mean, it's a great comedy. I mean, in terms of the writing, I think that's one of the best episodes and most serious episodes. Although I think when they take up the issue of AIDS among African-American women, that's a very serious episode too. But this is serious, right? Because this is that the Black church in America is a foundational, it's a cornerstone, right? For the Black family and for African-American communities.
So going back to designing women then, if Julia Sugar Baker is obviously supposed to be the role model for all the reasons she was articulate and successful and the leader of these four, was it the Annie Potts character of Mary Jo who was more the moral voice of reason? Or was it Delta Burke as Suzanne, who sort of stepped in and was able to, in her very Southern belle way, be the voice of change?
I guess the only time I ever really saw Delta Burke be that character is probably the one that you profiled so much about her weight, right? About that, the most changed character. I would say that was
in the AIDS episode. Who was that more that Mary Jo had the relationship?
Absolutely, because she was actually on the spot for sex education at the school, and she was set up as a debater being pro sex education, and she was being basically whipped by the other side by saying that she wanted condoms to be in the restrooms and that she had loose morals, and of course she was a single mom, so she would have espoused those kind of values. And she basically says, I don't think that my daughter or your son, there's nothing that they would do sexually that they should have to die for.
Yep.
And it just, I mean, that is the final word on the show anyway. To go back to your original question, I think there's no doubt in my mind that based on the research that I've done, that those characters served as role models for real people, and that people continuously go back to those episodes and say, I admire Khadija because she fought for flavor and she kept the magazine going, and she stood up for African-American women, for the African-American community, for her business, so on and so forth. That same thing with Mary Jo showed people how you could be a single mother and you could still be a working mother and you could still raise your children and have good friends and have a career. And that, yes, that did come at a cost, but it was worth it for her. I think in terms of role models, there was no shortage on any of the shows.
My last thought on this, do these shows also sort of role model what relationships require when you are in a friendship with four? You know, I mean, it's a luxury, I would say. There aren't that many women who have three good friends who are that tight and know each other as well. But that female friendships, particularly, you know, as adults, really do require a tremendous amount of patience and give and take.
Yeah, I do. And I think the people that watch those shows will have understood that in a different way than people who did not watch those shows, right? And, you know, and I don't know, like, what men think about that. And not that all men think the same thing, because obviously they don't. But I think that women were the primary viewers of those shows initially, and they did see things in those relationships that they were able to deploy in their own friendships. But also, yeah, I think I agree with you 100% that having mature, working, adult women relationships is challenging and complicated. And those shows did them justice, right? Did those relationships justice.
That is a wonderful way to end this conversation.
Thank you.
Wendy and I discussed whether there are any shows out there that are perhaps lingering under the radar that replicate this four-woman comedy gold that she has studied and we discussed. Now, at the time of our chat, we couldn't think of any. TV has become so international, though, it didn't occur to me that Derry Girls, which is found on Netflix, is indeed the 21st century addition to this list. Folks, Derry Girls, Derry, is phenomenal. And its setting is very non-American. That's why we haven't necessarily heard of it. It is set amid the political conflict of Northern Ireland, set in the early 90s, like the big hair Madonna 90s, teenagers in a working class town of Derry. It's a delight. If you are interested in watching Derry Girls on Netflix, it's a Netflix original. Americans may need to use the closed captioning function in order to understand everything that these four young women say. And I say that only because between the very rapid dialogue and some of the words that are distinct to that part of Northern Ireland, you really do have to pay attention and stay focused. They present fun situations, clever family character development. There aren't many episodes available, folks, but what there is fresh, saucy, and highly relatable. Here's a snip of a read-through of the Derry Girls cast and creator Lisa McGee did at the 2018 Edinburgh TV Festival.
I'm going to do stage directions.
Yes, Lisa.
Are you ready?
Yeah, ready to rock.
Quinn House, Erin's bedroom. Close up, an old photograph of Granda Joe smiling in his armchair by the fire, the family dog curled up on his lap.
I just can't get my head around it. The fact that he's gone forever.
She's sitting in a bed wearing her pyjamas. The gang are scattered around the room, also sporting nightwear. The curtains are drawn and the floor is cluttered with notebooks, fluorescent highlighters, pens, pencils, etc. Claire has her head buried in a textbook. She swigs a Red Bull and is surrounded by a dozen or so more empty, crushed cans.
It's so sad, it really is. It's so sad. But at the same time, you know what's done is done, so let's crack on.
Oh, I'm sorry, Claire. Has his sudden tragic death interrupted your studies?
It has a bit, actually, yeah.
How can you be so heartless?
Oh, don't cry, Erin. He's in a better place now. I mean, unless he's not, you know, unless he has gone to hell.
Can we talk about something else? I'm half torn. This is wrecking my head.
What? Have you been drinking?
Yes, I have. And for future reference, if any of you invite me to a study sleepover again and I'm desperate enough to accept that invitation, there's a good chance I have a litre bottle of Pinot in my bag.
I shouldn't even have to sit the exam, you know, on compassionate grounds.
He was a dog, Erin!
Toto was much more than a dog. Toto was my best friend.
Oh, Christ, I feel a bit bogey.
Michelle stands, draws the curtains, opens the window and sticks her head out for some air. Claire's confusion quickly turns to horror.
It's the morning. Sweet suffering Jesus, it's the morning. What are we going to do?
Well, maybe we could start with
Netflix, Derry Girls, enjoy. This series is still producing episodes, but really, has it been more than a decade since a hit 4-female series? If Summer, Wendy, and I have missed something obvious or international, drop us a line at advancedtvherstory@gmail.com. I am so grateful to Summer Martin of the Unconventional Woman podcast for her strong feelings and preparation for this extensive conversation. Someday, Summer and I are going to watch a lot of TV. Hold me to that, Summer, someday. Learn more about her podcast at www.tuwpodcast, the Unconventional Woman podcast. Follow Summer on Twitter at SummerGory, SUMMERGORY, or on Instagram at unconventional_woman. It is always fun to have Dr. Wendy Burns-Ardolino in the virtual studio. Wendy's been a longtime supporter and contributor to this podcast. Her current title in academia is Professor and Director of Grand Valley State University's Masters in Social Innovation program. The book she referenced in our chat is her 2016 TV's Female Foursomes and Their Fans. Wendy is an advocate in so many ways. Follow her on Twitter at Burns-Ardolino. Audio clips are from the 2018 Derry Girls live script read at the Edinburgh TV Festival. The festival's YouTube channel hosts that clip, and the Mara Brock-Akil quotes that you heard were from Madame Noir's YouTube channel, and it's a couple minutes of red carpet interview with Girlfriends cast and Mara Brock-Akil. Links to the episodes of this podcast that I mentioned in Conversation with Summer are found in the show notes, and those include the ones with Jennifer Cation Armstrong and Wendy Burns-Ardolino. A round of grateful applause to Catherine Yang, our sound designer, editor, and social media content support, and to the musician Jazzer, who is responsible for our podcast music, Take Me Higher. Find Jazzer's work at Free Music Archive. Stay up to date on the podcast's work behind the microphone by heading to tvherstory.com and signing up for the monthly e-newsletter. Not to worry, we won't sell you anything. We just like to share more good thoughts about TV women, role models, series old and new, stuff I'm watching, and some of the background work that goes into creating this podcast. And know that your email is safe with us. Yes, you are safe with us. Thank you for listening to this episode of Advanced TV Herstory, of trusting your ears to my voice. This episode and all of these ones talking about role models that stretch back decades. It's a good one to refer perhaps to somebody who is new to listening to podcasts or is looking to hear her own thoughts or their own thoughts about life that they saw in TV. Because in these trying times, finding representation and seeing ourselves and our stories told, that is more important than ever before. And that's why I podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.